Good afternoon. I am Dr. Angela Sinander, and I direct the Institute for Catholicism and Citizenship at the University of St. Thomas. The Institute, inspired by the Second Vatican Council, promotes civil discourse, faithful citizenship, and the common good by fostering theological insight and interdisciplinary inquiry into economic, political, and justice issues. I want to welcome you to our symposium on the common good, which is co-sponsored by the College of Arts and Sciences. In anticipation of Dr. Kristin Heyer's lecture this afternoon, St. Thomas faculty, staff, and students have participated in an interdisciplinary discussion of Dr. Heyer's book, Kinship Across Borders, A Christian Ethic of Immigration, sponsored both by the Institute for Catholicism and Citizenship and the Murphy Institute for Catholic Thought, Law, and Public Policy. Dr. Heyer wrote her book on immigration while a faculty member first in Southern California at Loyola Marymount University, and then in Northern California at Santa Clara. This past summer, she returned to Boston College, where she earned her PhD, to join the faculty as a full professor. She serves as co-chair of Catholic Theological Ethics in the World Church. She has served on the board of directors for the Catholic Theological Society of America and as an editorial consultant for Theological Studies, a prominent theological journal. Her first book, Prophetic and Public, The Social Witness of U.S. Catholicism, won the Best Book Award from the College Theology Society. This book very much resonates with the mission of the Institute for Catholicism and Citizenship. As we begin our reflection on migration and the common good, I would like to highlight the way in which Pope Francis draws our attention to migration in his apostolic exhortation on love in the family, which was released today. He states, "Migration is another sign of the times to be faced and understood in terms of its negative effects on family life." The recent synod drew attention to this issue, noting that in various ways, migration affects whole populations in different parts of the world. The Church has exercised a major role in this area. Maintaining and expanding this witness to the gospel is urgently needed today more than ever. Human mobility, which corresponds to the natural historical movement of peoples, can prove to be a genuine enrichment for both families that migrate and countries that welcome them. Furthermore, forced migration of families resulting from situations of war, persecution, poverty, and injustice, and marked by the vicissitudes of a journey that often puts lives at risk, traumatizes people, and destabilizes families. Migration is particularly dramatic and devastating to families and individuals when it takes place illegally and is supported by international networks of human trafficking. This is equally true when it involves women or unaccompanied children who are forced to endure long periods of time in temporary facilities and refugee camps, where it is impossible to start a process of integration. Extreme poverty and other situations of family breakdown sometimes even lead to families selling their children for prostitution or for organ trafficking. The persecution of Christians and ethnic religious minorities in many parts of the world, especially in the Middle East, are a great trial not only for the Church, but also for the entire international community. Every effort should be encouraged, even in a practical way, to assist families and Christian communities to remain in their native lands. He then continues and says, "Here I would stress that dedication and concern shown to migrants and to persons with special needs alike is a sign of the Spirit. Both situations are paradigmatic. They serve as a test of our commitment to show mercy and welcoming others, and to help the vulnerable to be fully a part of our communities." With these words in mind, I'm happy to welcome Dr. Kristin Heyer to St. Thomas to help us reflect on this reality of migration and the common good that Pope Francis describes.
Thanks, Angela, for that kind introduction and for the invitation to be here today. I've known Angela and Kara Anthony, who's here, for I realized 18 years, which may be an entire lifetime for those of you here for extra credit. Thanks for coming on a Friday afternoon. maybe I shouldn't have outed you all. Clearly we met as preschoolers, sorry. I'm really honored to participate in this symposium on the common good, particularly given such distinguished colleagues. And I think as the tenor of our recent political debates makes clear, migration stands as a sign of the times that particularly challenges a sense of the global common good, but also challenges a recognition of our shared humanity. So we've heard a great deal of rhetoric about migrants and refugees pouring across borders in recent years. And this presidential campaign season in particular, we've heard not only about building walls and deportation strategies, but in some cases, ugly epithets characterizing immigrants and their motives or their character. I must confess, I have found most of these characterizations pretty out of step with my own personal encounters with immigrants. So I thought I would begin this afternoon with some reflections from the border rather than Washington, D.C., as my relationships there have been formative for my own research, and folks working there continue their outreach and their advocacy no matter what the political winds of the day and the ebbs and flow and need. So, the Kino Border Initiative is a binational project of Jesuit Refugee Service, the California and Mexican provinces of Jesuits, the Missionary Sisters of the Eucharist, and then the two bordering dioceses in Ambos Nogales at the Arizona-Sonora border. During my last visit there, I spoke with recently deported migrants at their aid center. One gentleman had spent 26 of his 27 years in Central California, brought there as a one-year-old by his uncle. He had worked harvesting pistachios and almonds to support his wife and 4 U.S. citizen children without trouble, even on the occasions he couldn't produce a driver's license for a routine stop. And then in the past 2 years, each such stop had landed him in jail, with the third resulting in deportation to Nogales. So he expressed dread, really, at starting over in a country foreign to him. Up the road here at Casa Nazaret, we sat with deported women planning to reattempt the journey north in spite of the dangers that it posed. The women at the shelter were simply desperate to be reunited with their families on the U.S. side. One had worked at a Motel 6 in Arizona for many years, supporting her 2 citizen children after her own husband had left them. Describing her initial reason for migrating from southern Mexico, she said, "At home, either you eat or you send your kids to school." The Nazareth House residents repeatedly broke into tears as they shared the pain of being separated from their children, but also their experiences in detention. Closer to home, I have encountered undocumented college students in California also struggling with impossible choices. One recounts how a month after her high school graduation, ICE agents with loaded guns, bulletproof vests, and steel-toed boots surrounded her house and nearly pounded down the door, demanding to see her father. She said, "I came out to the front yard where the head agent asked my name while pulling out handcuffs as if standing in front of some criminal. No GPA or letter of recommendation could save me then. I fell to my knees in front of the agent and began pleading with him to let me stay, telling him I was starting college in a month on a special scholarship. He agreed to let me go, but only if I told him where my dad was. When her mortified mother nodded yes to go ahead and tell them, the student revealed the information and ICE left to arrest her dad in front of his coworkers and deport him. The student reflects, quote, "I stood in complete disbelief. I had sold out my own dad for an education." So experiences like these that really put flesh and blood on questions of citizenship and enforcement tactics have shaped my own reflections about the Christian narrative in light of migration and globalization. The number of people displaced reached 59.5 million globally in 2014, which was over 8 million more than the year earlier. This was the highest increase ever recorded in a single year. Here in the United States, the total number of undocumented migrants fell to 10.9 million in 2014, which is its lowest level since 2003. And yet 2015 saw steady increases in children and mothers arriving from the Northern Triangle countries of Central America, about 40,000 each per year, each of those categories. So when residents here are confronted with newcomers, some reactions reflect the nation's historic openness to immigrants, and in other quarters, its deep ambivalence about outsiders. Even with signals toward reform from some candidates, legitimate concerns about disproportionate burdens on local services and the need to set workable limits understandably persist. At the same time, the mounting threats to human dignity indicate the urgency of the system's genuine overhaul. So I was reminded, pardon my reach, I was reminded here in Green Valley, Arizona, walking the desert a few years ago, that the path of migrants en route to the United States remains paved by suffering and death, despite this unprecedented fortification and the search and rescue operations. The death toll of migrants crossing the deserts of Arizona has steadily mounted, even as the crossings decline. From the mid-90s, there have been more than 6,000 confirmed deaths, although those working in the desert estimate that it's 5 to 10 times that many. It's hard to get accurate numbers. But even at 6,000, it's roughly the same number of combined US soldier fatalities in Iraq and Afghanistan. The number of agents stationed at the border has quintupled over the past 2 decades, and spending on enforcement has increased 15-fold since 1986, when we last overhauled US immigration policy. Our immigrant nation's celebratory narrative underscores ideas like hospitality, liberty, and democracy. We might imagine beneath the Statue of Liberty Emma Lazarus's poem, "Give me your tired, your poor, huddled masses yearning to breathe free." And yet our debates have historically centered around issues of national security, economic instrumentalism, and social costs rather than human rights. Today, policy debates remain framed by a law and order lens, which casts unauthorized immigrants as willful lawbreakers, casting national security threats. A criminal rhetorical frame facilitates scapegoating immigrant threats to the rule of law without evoking any skepticism about the considerable mismatch between labor needs and legal avenues for pursuing work. I think the rule of law rightly occupies a privileged place in our country, and yet in travels to Arizona in Operation Streamline hearings, I've been struck by the sharp contrast of our law and order rhetoric on the one hand and the lack of accountability and transparency in our border patrol procedures on the other, and the lack of due process often offered our detainees. So we watched as immigrants shackled at the wrist and the waist and the ankles were collectively herded through the legal process. Lacking sufficient time with an attorney that day, some had seen an attorney for about 10 minutes, but some, even during the hearing, lacked adequate translation. So many were not completely comprehending what was happening. Migrants from Honduras and El Salvador in particular, with the world's highest numbers of homicides per capita, where gang members murder with impunity, are often migrating precisely due to the breakdown of the rule of law at home, moreover. So a second common paradigm deems newcomers as economic threats, whether as a net burden on the tax base or competitors for finite social resources and low-wage work opportunities. This is a perception heightened, of course, in times of economic downturn. Beyond studies that consistently show immigrant laborers provide a net benefit to the US economy, the detention industry profits off of irregular migrants and confounds the economic threat frame. At a press event in the midst of congressional debates 2 years ago, Congressman Randy Weber insisted that you don't get to come here and be takers, for example, even in the face of that week's Congressional Budget Office findings that found the proposed reform package would reduce the federal debt by $197 billion in the next decade and $700 billion in the following decade. Most economists agreed newly legalized immigrants generate more tax revenue than they expend in federal benefits. These elements of the immigrant industrial complex also have become a transnational multi-billion-dollar affair. So share prices for Geo Group and Corrections Corporation of America spiked sharply when the influx of migrant children crossing the border improved occupancy across their federal real estate portfolios. And then finally, a related lens is the perceived threat newcomers pose to a nation's identity. And I think we really see this evident in this campaign season. Anti-immigrant sentiment rooted in a construal of a fixed national identity over and above an outsider has led throughout history to these dynamics, including the demonization of populations of color through increasingly mainstream outlets. So we've had about a 40% increase in anti-Hispanic hate crimes in the last decade. The politics of exclusion continue to play out, whether in appeals to nostalgia or anxieties about rapid cultural and demographic changes, or more overt nativist and Islamophobic rhetoric. These representations of outsider as social menace have been reinvented in moments of national crisis. And so we see this pattern of how xenophobia can have a productive function in the national imagination. I was reading, this is my only Donald Trump reference, I was reading Donald Trump's presidential campaign has performed strongest among those who hold not only negative views about ethnic minorities, but among those who report that their ancestors are American. So on the whole, I think that these three frameworks reflect legitimate concerns regarding the contemporary status of immigration, but I think employed on their own, they can serve to distort and eclipse fundamental features of the whole picture. So I think that these operative lenses can mask realities and become surrogates for other cultural and political concerns. The voices of reluctant or desperate migrants rarely register in national debates about border control policies or visa quotas. And so I open with this context in an attempt to kind of shed light on the interests and values that primarily drive immigration policy. And so if fear and profit largely hold sway, dehumanizing newcomers according to these dominant scripts, I suggest the Catholic tradition's commitments shape a different story, a counter-narrative of our common humanity, our kinship, and that has implications for a just immigration ethic that serves the global common good. Christian understandings of what it means to be human radically critique pervasive exploitation and these prevailing paradigms. So I'd like to talk this afternoon a little bit about how insights from Scripture and Catholic social thought can offer this counter-narrative of civic kinship that will challenge these instrumentalist frameworks. Certainly, the story of Jewish and Christian pilgrim communities is one of migration and diaspora and the call to live accordingly. Indeed, after the commandment to worship one God, no moral imperative is repeated more frequently in the Hebrew Scriptures than the command to care for the stranger. Despite convenient amnesia in our own nation of immigrants, it was Israel's own bitter experience of displacement that undergirded its ethic of just compassion toward the outsiders. So you shall not wrong or oppress the resident alien, for you were aliens in the land of Egypt. When Joseph, Mary, and Jesus flee to Egypt, the emigre Holy Family becomes the archetype for every refugee family. In Matthew's gospel, Jesus begins his early journey as a migrant and a displaced person. Jesus, who in this same gospel would radically identify with the least and make hospitality to the stranger a criterion of judgment. Certainly, patterns of migration across Scripture do not solve complex contemporary dilemmas, and yet Scripture shapes moral perception. By engaging the voice of Scripture in a manner that dislocates these dominant frameworks, we can become attuned to how our perspective impacts our moral response, and even how Scripture might enhance our perceptive imagination. So if the conventional politics of immigration are driven in large part by these instrumental values, what might a scriptural politics of immigration prioritize in terms of a counter-narrative? One of the most persistently recurrent themes in Scripture, of course, is justice and compassion for the vulnerable. The prophets repeatedly connect bringing justice to the poor with experiencing God. Concern for the economically vulnerable echoes throughout the New Testament as well, particularly in the Gospel of Luke, which depicts Jesus being born in a stable among mere shepherds and as inaugurating his public ministry in terms that emphasize this mission to bring good news to the poor and release the oppressed. New Testament scholar Donald Sr. notes that, quote, in the overall landscape of the gospel stories, the rich and the powerful are often in place, reclining at table, calculating their harvest, standing comfortably in the front of the sanctuary, or seated on the judgment seat, passing judgment on the crimes of others. The poor, on the other hand, are often mobile and rootless, the sick coming from the four corners of the compass, seeking healing these crowds desperate to hear Jesus, roaming lost and hungry, or the leopard crouched outside the door. Senior suggests the mobility and experiences of migrant people reveal a profound dimension of all human experience, challenging false ideologies of unlimited resources or unconditional national sovereignty. Hence, whereas the scriptures do not provide detailed solutions to our contemporary economic and social challenges posed by immigration, for people who turn to the scriptures for guidance on what sort of people to become, it's clear they should show a deep concern for poor and marginalized persons. This concern for biblical justice challenges approaches to immigration driven by market or security interests alone. So I think a key contribution that the scriptural imagination offers is to bring the perspectives of the most vulnerable and often silenced into the equation. I have an image here from the Chinese artist He Qi, who actually now lives in Roseville, Minnesota. Just wanted to mention. So in Jesus' parable of the Good Samaritan, he identifies neighbor love and just living with care for the vulnerable stranger among us. And we recall Jesus reverses the expectations of the lawyer with the perceived enemy's loving response to the one in need dying in the ditch. Jewish audiences would have been shocked to hear of a discredited priest and a Samaritan exemplar. In the parable, the priest and the Levite noticed the wounded man, yet kept their distance to avoid any contact that might defile them. Unlike the Samaritan, who sees the man as a fellow human being in distress, the others just don't allow themselves to be affected by his plight. By sharp contrast, the Samaritan apprehends the situation as the man in the ditch experiences it. So typical of Jesus' parables where the ordinary keeps bursting out of the extraordinary, or the extraordinary rather out of the ordinary, the Samaritan surpasses the care that even would be appropriate to a fellow countryman to aid the stranger who might belong to his ethnic work group's worst enemies. As Bill Spohn notes, quote, Jesus stretches the limit of vision and compassion precisely where fear, enmity, and inconvenience want to constrict them. So how might this parable, where Jesus exposes the lawyer's categories as too cramped, shape our imagination about immigration? Posing the lawyer's very question of who is my neighbor erects boundaries between members and outsiders. We quickly remove ourselves from the scene to balance abstract duties and obligations. Our perceptions of immigrants as threats alone significantly influence immigration analyses. So I think this prior question of perception is key. Whom do we see as the immigrant? Freeloaders who take advantage of American generosity while taking jobs from US citizens? Men queuing up outside the Home Depot, or threats to the neighborhood? Kids overcrowding our own kids' public schools? Or the women I recounted at Casa Nazareth, the student whose narrative I told. I think if we see the face of immigration as illegal, anchor babies, forever foreigners, or if we see separated mothers, displaced small family farmers, taxpayers, honest workers, we pursue different avenues of analysis. Seeing immigrants' humanity as primary doesn't resolve conflicting claims over stretched resources, or absolve cases of immigrant crime. Yet it does foreclose on death dealing and profiteering practices, and it invites us away from simplistic scapegoating. So to get at root causes and complex motives, like the Samaritan, we must identify with and become neighbor to the immigrant. Jesus repeatedly serves as both host and guest across gospel narratives. He preaches a radical hospitality to those in need and commands the same of anyone hoping to sit down at the messianic banquet. So gospel hospitality is unqualified in nature, and its issuance converts lives. The despised tax collector, the estranged Samaritan woman, the exiled blind, even as it provokes animosity and criticism. So I'd say taking the victim side as our own enjoins not only compassion, but also liberation. Just as the Good Samaritan promises additional recompense to the innkeeper, Christians are called to enter the world of our neighbor and leave it in such a way that the neighbor is given freedom along with the very help that is offered. I think the unfreedom of present and would-be migrants pointedly illustrates the urgency of this responsibility. So this radical hospitality that shapes our vision doesn't relegate the immigration question to the realm of charity or largesse, or move it out of the inclusive civic conversation, but it requires justice. Oh, good. I even have that on the slide. Bonus. So I just wanted to point out a couple different types of injustice that I think immigrants typically face. The standard treatment of day laborers violates commutative justice, fundamental fairness, and exchange. As Angela said, I lived in LA when I was first starting this project, and at our parish in East LA, we had a kind of a sanctuary, a homeless shelter for men who were trying to get day labor jobs. And many would tell me that they would maybe paint all day for a family or do construction work, and the person hiring them would say, I'll meet you here tomorrow, same time, same place, and then I'll just pay you tomorrow night for both days' labor, right, never to be seen again. Actually, the Midwest, in the day labor study I last read, had one of the highest rates of wage theft like that, about 30%. And then the regional juxtaposition of relative luxury and misery, while basic needs go unmet, challenges notions of distributive justice. We know that the 2,000-mile US-Mexico border bisects the sharpest divide in average income on the planet. Outmoded policies, visa policies, or trade agreements impede rather than empower persons' participation in social life, social justice. And then finally, I think Christian ethics helps us look at restorative justice and complicity, given the role that receiving countries have often played in shaping the conditions that directly contribute to irregular migration. I was just reading somebody proposing an instability tax be levied, not just by nations, but on multinational corporations who have contributed maybe to the arms trade or to situations that are leading to conflict that are yielding large numbers of refugees or migrants. So attitudes and policies that compel and then punish irregular migration are profoundly at odds with Christian commitments. In particular, the tradition's understanding of human rights and the political community squarely challenges the fact that the vast majority of contributing and vulnerable migrants remain excluded from a viable, timely path to citizenship and its protections. Here in the US, the unfreedom immigrants experience fundamentally stems from this exclusion from membership in society. They remain deprived of the right to have rights, this primary good of membership. Flowing from its scriptural optical nerve of compassion, the Catholic social tradition champions robust rights for immigrants in its documents, outreach, and advocacy. We recently marked the 10th anniversary of the Mexican and US Bishops' Joint Pastoral, Strangers No Longer. And the Joint Bishops' Conference called for the US and Mexico to address root causes of and legal avenues to safeguard family unity. By contrast, border enforcement has remained the primary focus in the US context. I'd say the consequent deportation by attrition strategies and removal quotas have failed to resolve the problem of a significant undocumented presence. A Christian immigration ethic is grounded in its vision of the person as inherently sacred and made for community. All persons are created in the image of God, loved into being by God, and therefore worthy of inherent dignity and respect. And whereas this vision doesn't compromise autonomy, it understands humans as profoundly interdependent, right? To be a person is to be in relationship. And hence, human rights are claims to goods necessary for each to participate with dignity in community life. Catholic principles of economic and migration ethics protect not only civil and political rights, but also more robust social and economic rights and responsibilities. And so these basically establish persons not to migrate, their right not to have to migrate, to fulfill their basic rights in their homeland, and then rights of freedom of movement, their right to migrate if they can't support themselves or their immediate families at home. I would also add that this vision is fundamentally at odds with our national narrative at its best. As Network's Sister Simone Campbell put it during her Nuns on the Bus tour, fear is crippling us and promoting an unpatriotic lie of individualism. After all, the Constitution begins, we the people, not we who got here first, we the owners of businesses, or even we the citizens. She worried we would lose our democracy if we could not return to living in community. Once people do immigrate, the Catholic tradition profoundly critiques patterns where unstable receiving countries accept the labor of millions without offering legal protections. So these shadow societies risk the creation of a permanent underclass, harming both human dignity and the common good. So from Pope Leo XIII's warnings against employers' exploitation, up through Pope Francis's condemnations of harmful global economic practices, the protection of human dignity has remained the central criterion of economic justice. The tradition makes clear that every economic decision or institution has to be judged in light of whether it undermines or protects dignity realized in community. Pope John Paul II condemned the exploitation of migrant workers in particular, rooted in this principle that capital should be at the service of labor and not labor at the service of capital. This is one of my favorite pictures of him touring a soda plant in 1982, an Italian chemical plant that manufactured soda. This idea that the economy should serve the person raises serious concerns not only about the freedom of markets compared to people, but also I think about the significant financial stakes in our broken immigration system. Detained immigrants fill beds, and deportations fill private buses. So we also inherit this counter-narrative of economic ethics critiquing global dynamics that allow capital and goods and information to flow freely across borders, but not laborers. Pope Francis has been outspoken about the dictatorship of faceless economies that remain distant from humane goals. I think his image of humans as commodities in a throwaway culture particularly resonates with many vulnerable migrant workers' experiences. The Southern Poverty Law Center did this project interviewing undocumented women across various sectors of the food industry, and respondents overwhelmingly reported feeling like they were seen by employers as disposable workers with no lasting value, to be squeezed of every drop of sweat and labor before being cast aside. I include Archbishop Oscar Romero here too, as he kind of poetically elaborates this encyclical tradition's understanding of work as necessarily intelligent and free. He writes, "How beautiful will be the day when all the baptized understand that their work, their job, is a priestly work. That just as I celebrate Mass at this altar, so each carpenter celebrates Mass at his workbench, and each metalworker, each professional, each doctor with a scalpel, and the market woman at her stand is performing a priestly office. How many cab drivers I know listen to this message there in their cabs? You are a priest at the wheel, my friend, if you work with honesty, consecrating that taxi of yours to God, bearing a message of peace and love to the passengers in your cab." So the Catholic tradition explicitly protects the basic human rights of undocumented migrants in host countries in light of these longstanding teachings on workers' rights, which don't depend on citizenship status. And with more than 60% of undocumented workers here in the US having lived here more than 10 years, and 2 million undocumented students in our primary and secondary schools around the country, I think this double society increasingly threatens the common good. One visible with rights, one invisible without rights, this underground, voiceless underground of undocumented persons. Obstructing viable paths to legalization for the majority of immigrants that we welcome in the marketplace, but not the voting booth, most college campuses, or stable workplaces, risks making permanent this underclass of disenfranchised persons. And I would say that undermines not only Christian commitments, but also civic values and interests. So I would say this counter-narrative calls us to both reduce the need to migrate and protect those who have found the need to do so as a last resort. In contrast to the reductive soundbites and fear-mongering that dominate our election year airwaves, pursuing justice in terms of the common good, I think, also reorients the immigration question. Certainly the common good swims against significant cultural tides in our culture: moral privatism, libertarianism, relativism, polarizing ideological divisions, each of which harden resistance to communitarian commitments. The all-American credo that we pull up our bootstraps and make our own fate is perhaps as entrenched as it is incompatible with a solidaristic idea that we share each other's fate. The Catholic conception of the common good radically challenges a culture that prioritizes economic efficiency over solidarity with the weak and marginalized, or narrow national interest over global concern. A culture in which good fences make good neighbors, either due to intellectual weariness or isolationist fears, significantly hinders deliberative engagement about common goods. The Catholic tradition has elaborated, as you know, the temporal common good tradition, an increasingly global scope over the years, beginning in the 60s, talking about the relations between sovereign states. I think I'll skip a little bit of that for the sake of Friday afternoon. Whereas narratives blaming willful lawbreakers frequently prevail in the American media, this global common good lens contextualizes the individual acts of migrants and underscores, I would say, the social dimensions of justice and of sin alike. As Pope Francis elaborates in Evangelii Gaudium, quote, as long as the problems of the poor are not radically resolved by rejecting the absolute autonomy of markets and addressing these structural problems of inequality, no solution will be found for the world's problems. Echoing the core Catholic understanding of justice as meaningful participation, the Pope underscores the impact of economic exclusion repeatedly. And yet, as Archbishop McElroy has lamented, the Pope's diagnosis has not been welcomed by many American Catholics who criticize it as radical, simplistic, or misplaced. So I think the cultural assumptions fueling such resistance bid us to join economic analyses with sustained attention to social sin. For the globalization of neoliberal capitalism has contributed to transnational inequalities that issue many of these desperate efforts for basic survival. You'll remember Pope Francis's first trip outside of Rome, first official trip to Lampedusa. He commemorated there, in ritual and word, the then estimated 20,000 African immigrants who had died over the past 25 years trying to reach new life in Europe. He'll visit the Greek island of Lesbos a week from tomorrow to similarly show solidarity. But his 2013 homily there in the graveyard of Rex noted the pervasive idolatry that facilitates migrants' deaths and robs us of the ability to weep. Amid his admission that even he remains disoriented, I found it noteworthy and moving that he didn't merely condemn the world out there for indifference or for these consequences, but he himself repented. Forgive us, Lord, he said, whether for being closed in on our own well-being that leads to an anesthesia of the heart, or making global decisions creating situations that lead to these tragedies. And I think his reflections remind us that naming the reality of social sin can help shed light on these structures, but also attitudes that harm refugees and migrants and so many other victims of a throwaway culture. I think his words and his symbolism there reflect needs for ecclesial and civic repentance from complicity and injustice. And I think we don't attend to this as often as we should, even in the Catholic tradition. The last 2 years I've been preparing my sons for their first reconciliation, and I'm reminded of how seldom these social notions of sin register in our rites or on our radar. Pope Francis has continued to signal how challenging economic inequalities must extend beyond meeting needs or crafting policies to healing social sin. So identifying and countering these structural injustices and the attitudes or the ideologies that legitimate them, I think, is a key component of our pursuit of the global common good. I think these different levels intersect in complex ways. Pervasive internalized ideologies can make us susceptible to myths, and then operative understandings influence our action or our inaction. When bias skews values, it can become more difficult to choose authentic values over those that prevail in society. We've seen that these intersections with respect to the global economy have been of particular concern to Pope Francis. Warning that our economy of exclusion and inequality kills, he rightly challenges not only the reductive market ethos that reduces migrants to being pawns on a chessboard, but also their desensitizing effects. He writes, the culture of prosperity deadens us. Idolatries focused on having over being can impede the common good as much as nationalistic ones. They shape loyalties, frame questions, inform votes, even spending practices. I think some ideological currents of neoliberal globalization, whether fatalistic understandings of the price of progress or market fundamentalism, can configure our coordinates for what becomes conceivable. These ideologies reinforce international structures that impede accountability to a global common good. So these distinct elements of social sin can perpetuate inequalities. Lawmakers and industry lobbyists make concrete decisions that shape visa caps or commodity subsidies with harmful effects, or the primacy of deterrence has institutionalized security concerns rather than concerns for human rights or concerns for family unity in our immigration laws. When concerns about our national identity get distorted by fear or xenophobia, anti-immigrant sentiment can surge. But even at a more subtle level, I think a consumerist ideology can shape consumers' willingness to mistreat migrant laborers directly, but more often indirectly through our demand for inexpensive goods and services. So I think we can get into a tunnel vision here that lulls us into equating law abiding with just or just apathy. So probing this relationship between structural injustice and legitimating ideologies can help illuminate these modes of resistance to a Christian immigration ethic, but also a common good ethic more broadly construed. We could think of other examples. The siting of toxic waste dumps in politically and economically powerless communities certainly happens for a host of reasons, maybe histories of redlining, culpable real estate agents or city council members, but also our not always conscious desire to live near people who look and think and spend like us. So in light of the depth and lure of these entrenched patterns of social sin, the virtue of solidarity in service to the global common good can reframe migration as a shared international responsibility and help cultivate conversion. Institutional solidarity orients patterns of global interdependence from ones marked by domination to ones marked by reciprocity. I also want to raise briefly that these efforts toward realizing a common good and giving folks a place at the decision-making table and a voice who are most effective must also robustly engage women, particularly given the feminization of poverty and of migration across the globe. And I was happy to have Angela's excerpt from The Joy of Love at the outset. I just have to be honest, I left home at 5:30 this morning and I haven't read the newly released apostolic exhortation, but it sounds very relevant to what I'm about to say. It sounds like very promising developments, as the conversations at the Synod were, right, about ways in which these transnational dynamics and concrete practices really impact families and women in particular. As unaccompanied women undertake these journeys in increasing number, about half of migrants worldwide are women, they face unique threats, from sexual assault by smugglers and officials to harassment on the job, to manipulation in detention facilities. Less likely to qualify for employment-based immigration than men, the majority of migrant women work in unregulated jobs in the informal sector, whereas undocumented immigrants certainly earn lower wages than citizens in the same jobs. Women routinely earn less than their male counterparts. Undocumented women are often perceived by predators as the perfect victims of crime. They remain isolated, uninformed about their rights, and they're presumed to lack credibility. So women farm workers, we saw this a lot in the Central Valley, often wear bandanas and baggy clothing to hide their gender in order to deter assault. 80% of women of Mexican descent working in the Central Valley report experiencing sexual harassment, as compared to 50% of all women in the US workforce. Beyond well-founded fears that reporting abuses will risk job loss or family separation due to deportation, such women face language barriers and access to legal resources and cultural pressures. So the widespread abuse of women working at the Postville, Iowa meatpacking plant, for example, initially went unreported. Girls as young as 15 who worked the plant's night shift were continually harassed by supervisors, but they said they couldn't afford to speak up and lose their jobs, indebted as they remained to their coyotes, their smugglers. Because these women understood that immigration officials collaborate with law enforcement, they didn't seek help from the latter. Migrant women also frequently cite family reunification as their primary motive for migrating. Today, we have 16.6 million in this country living in mixed status families. Last year, ICE removed over 72,000 immigrants who reported they had US-born children, like the narratives I shared at the outset. And then in the aftermath of detention or deportation, these families face major economic instability. The affected children suffer poor health and behavioral outcomes, and these threats affect families on both sides of the border. So I would say beyond a critique of economic idolatry, the sanctity and the social mission of the family developed in Catholic ethics indicates how these conditions that perpetuate family separation really undermine the common good. In spite of immigrants' courage and resilience, many of these patterns obscure their full humanity as spouses, parents, and children. So an operative value hierarchy prioritizing capital to persons is harmful to families in particular. And I think the sanctity and the social mission of the family developed in Christian ethics can reorient immigration stakes away from political calculations or deportation quotas. Families comprise our most intimate relationships, such that protracted separation threatens our very subjectivity, our core relationality. I think especially for Latino families with whom I've talked, they talk about their primary identity as family member. Ada Maria Isasi Diaz talks about La Familia as the primary cultural institution in her culture, saying it functions as a duty, a support system, really a primary identity marker. So those migrant women whose agency is caught up in motherhood, the inability to provide for or reunite with those children can fracture integrity in profound ways. So we have many examples in Hebrew and Christian scriptures of displaced families, uprooted, and I think that the Christian family ethic can reorient our immigration paradigm in some constructive ways. Relational anthropology, family as domestic church and mediator of covenantal love, and in particular, the family's social mission. The Catholic social tradition integrates a family's intimate communion with its charge to broadly engage the social good. And so if this integral family humanism is a central part of what it means to be family, then raids or a lack of dignified labor opportunities signal hostile social forces that are impeding families' access to these social goods. So migrant women's experiences of assault and on the move and on the job, together with these disruptions to family life, incur patterns that are at odds with Christian commitments to human rights and the sanctity of family life. If the Good Samaritan attunes us to see the face of immigration in, for example, the women at Casa Nazaret, we are reminded that migration decisions are rarely personal choices alone. A migrant woman's decision to abandon her children for longer-term prospects for them, better prospects, work without documents, or as increasingly common, have relations with another male traveler or coyote to ensure a safe passage. These are decisions that occur within constrained social contexts. These means are not morally or otherwise desirable, but understanding the realities shaping choices like these, I think, highlights the shortcomings of an individualistic paradigm. Such women's experiences highlight the inadequacy of approaches that just flatly criminalize migrants, such as, what part of illegal don't you understand? So, in closing, talking points that highlight scarce resources, scheming lawbreakers, or demographic threats fail to register then these social contexts that compel migration and also its harmful consequences, ruptured family lives, border deaths, and gender-based violence. And I think one of the challenges is that fear is pretty easily mass-marketed, and yet understanding across difference is harder to come by and to engender. So I wanted to close with two brief signs of hope in that regard. First is Pope Francis's ongoing witness to encounter and solidarity. I think beyond his powerful witness at Lampedusa, and more recently washing the feet of Muslim, Hindu, and Copt refugees on Holy Thursday, in his historic address to the US Congress here last fall, Pope Francis addressed immigration in the US context. And there he summoned listeners to something seemingly far less radical than kinship, the Golden Rule. Identifying as a fellow descendant of immigrants from a shared continent of foreigners, he asked the American people, through their representatives, to identify with the needs and dreams propelling the immigrants traveling north in search of a better life. He asked, is this not what we want for our own children? He pleaded with us not to give in to a temptation to discard them as troublesome or dehumanize them due to their numbers. Citing Matthew 7:12, he transformed what might seem to be a lower bar for ethics than those talking about subversive hospitality. He didn't call and use my subversive hospitality. So this lower bar of the Golden Rule promotes mutual understanding across difference. With characteristic clarity and directness, he asked, in a word, if we want security, let us give security. If we want life, let us give life. If we want opportunities, let us provide opportunities. The yardstick we use for others will be the yardstick which time will use for us. So I think Pope Francis's prophetic solidarity throughout his papacy and his unwavering attention to these ideologies that inhibit kinship offer us a way forward. But I'd like to give the last word to a former student at Santa Clara University who also spoke out courageously on public radio a few summers ago in their series called My Life is True.
We had to decide whether we were going north or south to get into California. My friend decided it would be best to go south to avoid the big snowstorm up north, but south would take us through Arizona. I really, really didn't want to go through Arizona. I got more and more nervous. I felt paralyzed. My friend kept asking me what my problem was. Finally, I told him. I'm undocumented. I came to the United States when I was 3 with my family, and Arizona had just passed a law that gave police officers the authority to check people's immigration status. If we got stopped in Arizona, I could be detained and deported. My friend is white. He comes from a really privileged upper-class background. He attended a private high school, then Santa Clara University with me. I went on scholarship. Politically, he sees things a little differently than I do. We've had our disagreements. He was quiet for a while. Then he barraged me with questions. I answered the best I could. Silence again. Then he told me about his grandfather, how he hadn't been able to find work in Ireland, so he decided to hop on a fishing boat and get off in New York. He worked as a janitor without citizenship. Now his son, my friend's father, is a high-ranking bank executive. The whole time through Arizona, my friend drove like 50 miles an hour. He didn't even want to change lanes. He told me he wasn't going to lose his best friend. He wasn't going to let that happen. The immigration debate became real to my friend in the car that day. We had a very different conversation than the one politicians are having right now. The minute actual undocumented immigrants are included, the conversation always changes. Now I'm completely open about my status. I'm still afraid. Conversations don't always go well, and it's always a risk. But as long as I remain in the shadows, I will never really get to know you, and you'll never really know me. With a perspective, this is Jose Arriola.
The opinions expressed in the Perspective series are those of the commentator.
So Jose's courage, together with the resilience of so many others, I think witnesses to enduring hope. Christians are called to live in anticipation of a new heaven and a new earth and cooperate with the abundance of life already inaugurated. Taking the migrant side as our own challenges our perception with implications for political discourse, policy, even university pedagogies. Amid the pervasive scripts and misinformation that cloud the exploitation of immigrants, a Catholic ethic of kinship across borders offers guideposts along the journey from exclusion to solidarity. We who are settled must remember that even remaining adrift in a sea of indifference is a privilege. So may the church strive to heal the wounds of social sin that threaten our common good and our common home. Thanks.
Thank you for bringing us beyond the sound bites of the political debates to think more deeply about migration and the common good. We now have some time for questions.
There's also lemonade, I see. Please.
Oh, am I supposed to use this mic? I need the mic. There's lots of things that I wanted to ask about, but I just want to ask about two things real quick, just to get your take on them. The first would be a kind of skepticism that I have about the use of the terms common good and social sin, and kind of even sort of social good, because it's been my experience that unfortunately there either is no common good, but there's a class war, and that's what it is. The country is not, there's no common good in the country. There can't be. Or so that there's no concrete sense of what that would actually feel or look like, that when bishops or others use those kinds of terms in an argument or as a way of like motivating people, they tend to be almost like, for many people, experientially contentless. And you could argue that in fact, that's the aim of why ICE is going after undocumented immigrants. The U.S. Marshals now are going after people that don't pay their student loans. So, you know, we have migrants are scapegoats, blacks are scapegoats, Muslims are scapegoats. Soon it's going to be students that don't pay their student loans. So we're increasing the amount of scapegoats that we need within the country. The second question I would, so just what, you know, part of me sometimes just thinks like this whole thing is just is too moralistic and ideal, this approach. Although I just want your take on some of these more, I don't know, cynical responses about the capacity for anyone to like move on this issue. The second thing is I wonder what you think about the drug war, because it seems to me like one reason why NAFTA makes a lot of sense is because of the drug war. Because the good thing about NAFTA is that I can move my company down to Mexico, which is not very far away, but it has the greatest cutoff in average wage in the world around that border. But also the great thing about the drug war is that it ensures that region will always be destabilized and so won't be able to develop. So it'll keep the wages relatively cheap there. And I wonder, like, the question as to sort of the drug war in particular in the States in connection with immigrants both wanting to get out, and then the way that it functions in the States to sort of make sense of these other bigger issues that you raised. Thanks.
Sure, thank you for the questions. I'll try to remember all the points you brought up. You can remember me. The first was there's no such thing as the common good, right? Or it's too moralistic. And the second is how the drug war plays into these dynamics. I hope you're sticking around for the next few talks. Other people have my back that there's such thing as the common good. I think one thing I would say to that, certainly it's hard to come by, it's hard to engender in light of what you said. I think the ideological polarization, I know I rattled off a couple of impediments to the common good, but ideological polarization has only gotten worse since I've been at this. I really do think echo chambers by practices, whether where you get your news sources, who you talk to, social media, by people on all forms of the spectrum, hardens that resistance. But I think one of the benefits of the Catholic tradition on the common good is that not only is it discussed in terms of conditions for flourishing, right, for members of a community or a telos, but also as a process and as a lens. So a process that doesn't take place over and against the experience of pluralism, right, but that engages and takes different stakeholders seriously in deliberative democratic conversation about what constitutes the common good at its best, right? So I really do think that as another maybe lens, to go back to the early slides, could profoundly shift our political discourse from, not even in Christian terms, like Barber, I want X is typically, are you better off than you were 4 years ago, make America great again, to X would be good for the community to which I belong. Not just in terms of maybe hospitality to strangers seems too radical and demanding, but civic virtues of democratic engagement or security. I mean, ways in which bringing people out of the shadows is also good for security ends, right? Not just human rights ends. So I think it's increasingly countercultural. I'll give you that. I don't think it's all contentless or class warfare per se.
I actually think that they're not the common good stuff is class war, but that we actually live in a country which is served by class war. So that's why there is a common good. Because when I live in the Hamptons, the question of what's going to be my community good is very different than if I live on the same house.
Okay, sure. So then I think making more apparent to people our de facto interdependence. I mean, even people on the Hamptons are slicing bananas on their morning cereal, right? So looking at ways in which our eating or our spending practices actually do wrap us up in a web of relationship. And then what's the quality of that relationship? I think NAFTA and the drug war is very complex. I would say, and maybe you are also being facetious there to say why NAFTA is great as it can drive down prices. So certainly to maximize profit, it's great, right? I think the drug war dynamic actually does point to the dynamics I was hoping to draw out here in this way. We typically talk about the drug war in terms of risk and violence and them coming over here and infecting safe society, and yet the market for illegal drugs often comes from suburbs in the States, right? So it's not just narco traffickers, who I wouldn't want to hold up as role models, but again, the kind of complicity and the interrelatedness of these dynamics, whereas our rhetoric is pretty reactive and takes people involved in this off the hook in terms of sustaining a market. I mean, the other problematic thing is, even if you look at smuggling, these used to be, for lack of a better phrase, mom and pop operations. And with narco traffickers taking over even human trafficking networks, you can extort a migrant's family more than a cocaine brick. So that becomes even more profitable and dangerous and so forth. Thank you.
Hi, thanks, Kristin. I had a question about national identity. You mentioned the reference to those who are most likely to vote for Trump as claiming I'm American or something like that. And this may be an issue that is more on the ground in Europe, in various countries in Europe, than it is currently in the United States, but clearly it's here as well. But I guess it seems to me one missing piece here is the datum of national identity, or even ethnic identity, but that national identity. I guess are there resources for thinking about that, theologically speaking, in your opinion, in a way that just simply doesn't overlook it, mm-hmm. Right? I think we tend, as Americans, speaking a bit ironically here, I suppose, to overlook mm-hmm. the influence of the importance of national identity and the role it plays in many parts of the world. So whether from a biblical or a historical perspective, are there resources for talking, do you think, about talking positively about national identity in ways that perhaps avoids nationalisms mm-hmm. That have been, of course, so destructive in recent history?
Thank you for the question. I think that's right. That third lens, I'm not going to risk going back to the kind of social security, national identity lens, I think is the trickiest, because I think we can look at economic data that, largely these arguments are not fact-driven, as we know, right? We're more operating out of fear, and reason is just the little tiny rider on the elephant of our emotions and fears. And yet, social identity, I think, is a really big one. And we see it popping out in extreme ways, maybe in the campaign. But I think you're right, this is a legitimate concern as people see the faces of their neighborhoods changing, the languages in which the liturgies are said at their mass changing. There's all sorts of kind of subtle dynamics or indicators that even ask kind of, what does it mean to be American? And I raise that correlation more as an interesting in terms of amnesia, right? This sense that if we look at historically the spikes in anti-immigrant sentiment, whatever the most recent wave was, tend to correlate with economic downturn, and we keep kind of reinventing this question, and yet it's been with us. I think off the top of my head of Aquinas and the orders of love, I think there's certainly a strand there that would say the Catholic tradition is not pure cosmopolitanism, open borders, let's get rid of, I think national sovereignty is a right, but a limited right in the tradition, that there's a good of orders of love closest to us that can become perverted or that should be overridden sometimes. But that sense of even patriotism in the sense of love of country, not jingoistic patriotism, I think you could find there. I think there's helpful work in our disciplinary partners in social science and political science on this, kind of looking at how ethnocentric nationalisms tend to focus more on bloodline or characteristics, right? Compared to a civic nationalist strand that would look at, well, what are the ideals that regardless of our religion, of our race, our ethnicity, our background, that we can sign on to as members of this common good or of this secular republic. So I think there too, getting away from unhelpful metaphors, the melting pot was big for so long, at least when I was in grade school, that really asks people to be shorn of their own identities if they're newcomers, and kind of this bland amalgamation in the service of social unity. I don't love the mosaic or the tossed salad, but maybe the symphony, just somehow better images that can both allow us to make harmony together, but also retain our specific identities, especially as we incorporate newcomers, so that assimilation doesn't become kind of problematic. Thanks for the question.
You alluded to the intersection of a couple of different topics, one of the legitimacy of national borders and how that fits into an approach based on kinship and universality. And also then there's the question of the refugees. And those, as I talk with people about how we work through this question of legalization and citizenship for the undocumented country now, one of the most important elements of the conversation that I'm able to have with people is based on that traditional teaching about a nation has the right to control its borders. Now, it also has obligations vis-a-vis refugees.
Right.
And so how does that intersect with this notion of civic kinship in a way that has a claim, but not a claim that is so diffuse as to repudiate the traditional teaching of the church on the question?
Good. Thank you. I do think there's some tension, but it's not irresolvable when the tradition states that nations have the right to control their borders, but that right is not absolute, right? So we could think of humanitarian intervention or ways in which major human rights violations could warrant that being overridden. And as you say, also in the case of refugees, when there's a credible fear of persecution upon return, and it might help even to think not just of economic migrants, but particularly these Northern Triangle countries, Honduras, El Salvador, Guatemala, just the pervasive level of violence and lack of any recourse, really violence with impunity, and particularly these reports coming out about femicide and targeted murder of women and children. So maybe that's easier to talk about than relatively better standard of living. So I think there's a tension there, but that it's not irresolvable if we talk about the common good in a way that protection of human rights is constitutive of respect for the common good, right? So when there are these major human rights violations and there's an ability of a nation to accommodate such flows, then a claim can be made. I think when I talk to people, what I think fails to register is our current practice of kind of at once saying no trespassing and help wanted, right? So at once saying we have 5,000 available low-wage non-agricultural visas, but employ on average 800,000 a year. So I think that kind of having it both ways effect obscures some of these distinctions between rights of national sovereignty and accommodating extreme need, or this country's efforts to kind of fast track the claims by people coming, in this case, from the Northern Triangle countries. We could say, this judge recently saying, I can teach a 3 or 4-year-old how to defend his case in court in the rocket docket, or paying Mexico to intercept. So I think some of these practices need to be unearthed to show there may be more of a possibility with a commitment to civic kinship to at once underscore the rights of nations to control their borders, but also accommodate people with urgent claims, not I'm searching for a relatively better standard of living, or redress, I would say, exploitative practices of kind of relying upon labor but not granting full rights.
Thank you for your talk. I kind of sense a little bit of your frustration or skepticism. I'm a firm skeptic in this whole thing. Maybe you could talk about two things. Number one, we've heard a long time about the military-industrial complex. I loved your phrase, the immigration industrial complex and the criminalization of immigration. Instead of it's a complete, and there's lots and lots of money behind that.
Yeah.
The second thing is, as a Catholic, I see a lot of statements from the bishops, and which I tend to agree with, but I don't see a lot of Catholic clergy on the front lines. I do see some of my Protestant clergy on the front lines advocating. And I see Pope Francis being a strong spokesperson here, attracting Catholics to at least look in that direction. But maybe you can help me. I remember Cesar Chavez. He was a spokesperson. He was recognized, and he was recognized for the migrant workers. Can you tell me any Catholic spokesperson who can stand up to what's going on? We will stand up, and I'm not pro-abortion, but we will stand up if there's a slightest implication that the government is involved in any way, shape, or form, possibly in abortion issues. And yet, what we see in the news and hear, nothing. At least given the audacity of what we hear currently from, at least on the Republican side. So I'm very, as one who has been to the border in El Paso at Nazareth House and Annunciation House, I don't speak much Spanish, but as one who believes in the Church's social justice, I am glad to see the University of St. Thomas, where I have worked at some time, paying attention, a little more attention to this issue. I do know DACA students, and hopefully more of them will come to the University of St. Thomas with help from the university.
Great.
It's pretty rambling, but that's where I'm coming from.
Thank you. Maybe I could just offer a few reflections, few signs of hope in response to the cynicism, but I understand the frustration. First, the immigrant industrial complex. Yeah, I think that I agree with you that it's problematic, not just the criminalization of what's a civil offense, but also the privatized financial stakes in this system. Right. Right. I also think in addition to Homeland Security kind of outsourcing to these privatized detention centers, it's not even just a concern about financial stakes, but also transparency and accountability. So some of these centers are in like unmarked strip malls, you know, even if people don't care about the share prices, I think just as democratic citizens, not having more accountability and transparency when we get reports on conditions inside some of these detention centers. I do see some clergy on the front lines of this in really prophetic leadership roles. I would say the binational group that I opened with, the Keno Border Initiative, actually emerged organically. It's not what was asked for. The diocese in, I believe, Phoenix, asked the Jesuits in California just to send a priest. They were low, they needed somebody to help out in parishes. And the California province of the Jesuits said, well, we'd actually like to do an inductive needs assessment and see what are the most crying needs at the border. And they took this long, I often call this painstaking inductive needs process, which in theory I am very in favor of. And in practice, I was the wife of the husband conducting it home with newborn and a toddler. So I always notice I'm stressing painstakingly inductive. But I think it was good. They listened to a lot of people on both sides of the border and found 3 big areas of concern. One was the vulnerability of women who are being deported. So the Casa Nazareth shelter was started. One was the closer you got to the border on the US side, the less people wanted to talk about this. So they found they did not have people preaching in parishes like you're asking because they were afraid of alienating members of their community. So if you have Border Patrol next to undocumented parishioner side by side in a pew, they found it was easier just to not talk about this. So they started one kind of pastoral outreach program for conscientization and pastoral formation. And the third was research and advocacy. So in addition to hosting scholars, they've done a lot of intake and research from the folks staying in the shelter or eating at the Commodore, and been able to put together reports that they've then presented in congressional hearings. So conditions in detention facilities, sexual violence against women was the second one. And Father Sean Carroll, who's been the executive director of that from its inception, I do think has been kind of out front and center. You might remember they hosted a group of bishops there in Nogales a few years ago, after which there were a couple of very prophetic statements, framing it in the terms that you use, that this is a life issue in our church, or I was trying to show this is a family values issue. It's not typically, I haven't read the document yet, but it's not typically before this morning at 6 a.m. the way we hear about family values issues in political or ecclesial settings, but certainly these are practices that are harming families and tearing them apart. Finally, I would say one subversive practice that also comes out of a clergy commitment. At my last university, Santa Clara, they have a full scholarship program for undocumented students, the Hurtado Scholars Program. And for many years, that was under wraps, and I would have emails from people saying, I'm not asking for me, but a friend of a friend wants to know. You know, it was very covert. But the rector of that community gave an interview to USA Today College Edition, and kind of outed the program. Somebody said that they had heard about this, and she said, isn't that completely unfair to all of the hardworking citizen applicants who are denied a scholarship in light of that money? And Father Michael Zampelli said, well, it's our money. We can do whatever the hell we want to with it. So that was a case in which I felt like that was the leadership of here's how we're choosing to use our money, even at the expense of angering donors and alums. So I agree with you. We need much more visibility and prophetic preaching, and I think that kind of going to the border as you did, I kind of brought this shoe to the pristine halls of Congress because I thought you're so distant and removed from the reality. We need to find ways to bridge that experience. But I do also see signs of hope.
Thank you very much. I think my question probably was a little answer with his, but one of the things that I loved in your book was when you talked about incarnational solidarity and how important it is that we actually are solidary by encountering the other. And it goes a lot with Pope Francis' message that we have to go outside. Yeah. And I just wanted to ask you what you thought about the role of the church and theologians in this country, because as Jose Arreola was saying, I need to get out of the shadows so I can know you and you can know me. Nice. And we see a lot of lack of knowledge of each other, especially through this campaign and the xenophobia going on, and how that is affecting how our country might elect their leaders. So I just wanted to ask you, what is the role of the theologian? What is the role of the church? I know the church is doing a lot. I know many priests here, and I know it everywhere, doing a lot of work. But at the same time, I see a lot of divided communities. You know, there's a parish with a Latino ministry where the parishioners, the English-speaking parishioners, don't have any relationship with the 500 people that meet every Saturday or Sunday for Mass. Yeah. What can we do to enhance those relationships for people to understand that there's real people there, and there's this human person behind, so that idea of the common good doesn't seem an abstract reality, but that's something that it really touches the heart and goes back to the gospel and its values.
Good. Thank you so much. I do think the Roman Catholic Church is uniquely poised to be a sign of hope and offer a counter-narrative on this, not because of its teachings, not only because of the teachings that I presented, but it's kind of a transnational NGO compared to national communities. Or as challenging as it is, it has parishes that have side-by-side people on all sides of this issue, but also all life experiences, as you say, compared to this gentleman's example from the Hamptons, or we could think of many other echo chamber groups in our civil society. So I think that we're uniquely poised, and yet those incarnational solidarity practices that I bring out that are intended to complement the more institutional solidarity and intellectual solidarity remain pretty countercultural. And I think if we take social sin seriously and the grip, how thoroughgoing this kind of consumerist attitude and fear-based division is, then these inconvenient, difficult countercultural practices where we cultivate this encounter by being with people who are different than us and think different than us is key. Jose Arreola came to my classes when I taught at Santa Clara twice, and I was saying at lunch it was always the most nerve-wracking class of the year. They might be the two most nerve-wracking of my career, because I wanted to make sure the rest of my students were hospitable and kind of move them to a place where even if they disagreed with him, they weren't going to pull out their cell phone and call ICE on him, and be able to receive him. But what strikes me that he said once in response to your question was, it's important to do political advocacy, it's important to do outreach. My students were all involved in community-based learning sites around San Jose. He said, but you know what I want you to do? He said, bring this up in polite conversation. He said, talk about immigration at cocktail parties. Be courageous on your social media sites. He said, people are unwilling to have these conversations, and so we just agree to disagree and kind of impoverish the moral and the moral good, the social discourse in that way. And I think that can often be harder, right? To say at your parish, why do we have 2 tracks in pastoral ministry that's Spanish-speaking and English-speaking, never the 2 shall meet? Or why do we have even different social events that aren't integrated? I think kind of starting at home in some of those boundary crossing ways could be a way in which we model that encounter. So thank you.